All right, today we're going to dive into a feeling that, let's be honest, a lot of us have probably felt but maybe never really talked about. It's that deep, strange desire to just vanish. I mean, have you ever had that feeling, that just overwhelming wish to hit a reset button on your entire life? You just want to go to sleep and wake up somewhere completely new, as a totally different person. And it's not about wanting things to end, it's about wanting to live, just in a completely different way.
And look, this is a really, really important distinction to make right from the get-go. What we're talking about here isn't a desire for an endpoint, not at all. It's a desire for a new beginning. It's about wanting to escape your current life, not life itself.
Okay, so let's dig into this feeling a little deeper. What exactly is it? And, who feels this way?
Yeah, it's kind of like this fantasy of just logging out of your own life, where all the pressure, all the memories, all the expectations, they just dissolve. Just imagine it. A world with no rude boss, no constant rejection, no judgment from anyone. A world where you can just be without carrying the entire weight of your past on your shoulders.
And what's so wild about this feeling is just how universal it is. I mean, it hits people who are dealing with the daily grind for sure, but it can also totally consume the most successful people out there. I mean, look at someone like Leo Tolstoy. The guy had everything: fame, a family, tons of money. And yet, right at the peak of his success, he was just crushed by this overwhelming feeling that it was all for nothing, absolutely meaningless.
So that feeling, that emptiness, it really brings us to some big philosophical ideas that give it some serious weight. You start to wonder, where does this deep sense of meaninglessness even come from? Well, the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer had let's just say, a pretty bleak take on it. He basically argued that we're all driven by this blind, totally irrational force he called the will to live. And this will keeps us on a hamster wheel, constantly chasing desires that we can never really satisfy. It traps us in this endless cycle where, according to him, suffering is just a normal part of being alive.
So, what's the bottom line from Schopenhauer? It's this. If life is nothing more than a painful, endless cycle of wanting things, then, well, maybe not existing is actually the better deal. It's a super dark thought for sure, but it really gets to the core of why the idea of just disappearing can sound so tempting.
And that idea kind of feeds directly into what we now call nihilism. See, after the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche famously said God is dead, those old-school sources of meaning, like religion, they started to crack. And without some grand divine plan, what are we left with? Well, we're left staring into the void, forced to accept that maybe we're just these tiny, insignificant specks in a huge, completely indifferent universe. And man, that can be absolutely terrifying.
And this feeling, this deep, profound sense of despair, it wasn't just some abstract thing for philosophers to debate. No way. We see it echoed so powerfully in art, in literature, and throughout history.
Just listen to this quote from Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. The main character is so completely isolated, so filled with self-hatred that he feels like he's failed at everything, even at being as small and meaningless as an insect. I mean, wow, it's just a completely devastating way to express feeling worthless.
And you see this nihilistic despair all over literature. It's in characters like Kirillov, who just dives headfirst into self-destruction. You see it in the underground man, who practically takes pleasure in how miserable he is. And then, of course, there's Kafka's Gregor Samsa, who literally turns into a giant bug, becoming the physical embodiment of feeling like a meaningless burden to everyone around him. But maybe the poet Heinrich Heine summed up this whole feeling best with this one absolutely haunting line. It's pretty much the ultimate expression of wanting to escape not just your life, but existence entirely.
Okay, but here's where things get really interesting. This feeling, this deep, dark despair, it doesn't have to be an endpoint. In fact, it can be a beginning. Think of it like a crossroads.
So the real question becomes, when you're standing at that crossroads, in that dark place, what happens next? Which way do you go?
Because really, from this one single thought, two very different paths can open up. On the one hand, this feeling can pull you down into the spiral of overthinking and anxiety, where you're just stuck wondering why everything feels so empty. But on the other hand, it can be the very thing that lights a fire under you. It can be a powerful catalyst that basically forces you to rebuild your life from the ground up.
And that choice, that brings us to our final section. How do we find a way out of the dark? How do we actually create meaning in a world that can feel so meaningless?
Well, the existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre offered a pretty powerful and, kind of intimidating answer.
He said we are condemned to be free. Think about that. There's no script, no one is going to hand you your purpose. And yeah, that's scary, but it's also incredibly empowering. It means you have the total freedom and the total responsibility to create your own meaning. And here's another thought. What if that feeling of always wanting something more, what if it isn't a bug, but a feature of being human? The philosopher Simone Wells suggested that we're basically creatures of longing. So maybe that constant dissatisfaction isn't a sign that life is broken. Maybe it's just a sign that we're actually truly alive. And that leads us to a really powerful, practical idea. You don't find meaning by just thinking about it. You find it through action. So often, happiness comes from the process of building something. It could be a business, a family, a new skill, or even just building a better version of yourself. The act of creating, it gives you real tangible proof that you have power, that you have agency. It's the perfect antidote to that feeling of powerlessness that nihilism feeds on. And this brings us right back to Dostoevsky, who I think offered one of the most beautiful answers to all of this. When he said, "Beauty will save the world," he wasn't talking about pretty sunsets or escaping pain, not at all. He meant that real, true beauty is found when you face hardship head-on. You absorb it and you transform it into something else. It's like an alchemy of the soul. For him, the person who goes through incredible suffering and comes out the other side with compassion and forgiveness, that person becomes a living, breathing work of art. You know, in the end, so much of it is about perspective. Henry Ford said, "Life is a series of experiences." And it's so true. The really tough ones. Those are often the very experiences that forge us into someone stronger, someone bigger than we were before, even if it's impossible to see that when you're in the middle of it.
So let's go back to that idea of a crossroads. If that deep desire to disappear is a crossroads, then it's a choice. It's not an endpoint. It's a starting line. The real question isn't if you'll ever feel that emptiness. It's when you do, what will you choose to build?